July 6, 2018, 7 a.m. in Washington, D.C., the Trump administration imposed tariffs on $34 billion worth of Chinese goods. The decision, reached after months of escalating accusations over trade deficits, intellectual property theft, and lost manufacturing jobs, sent shockwaves across offices, ports, and trade administrations worldwide. The US had earlier warned that it will impose even more tariffs should China retaliate. In Beijing by 3 p.m. local time, just 8 hours later, China strikes back. A mirror response. $34 billion in American goods, now subject to retaliatory tariffs. No negotiation, no pause. For the first time in the 21st century, the world's two largest economies had declared open economic warfare. But this war didn't start in July 2018. It had been building for decades. In factory towns like Dayton and Toledo, in logistics hubs like Ningbo and Shenzhen, and in global summits from Davos to Buenos Aires. The US-China trade relationship didn't begin with tariffs. It began with a handshake. In 1972, President Richard Nixon became the first US leader to set foot in communist China, meeting Mao Zedong. The Cold War was raging, but Nixon saw an opportunity: open up China and tilt the global balance against the Soviet Union. Trade was the Trojan horse. On January 1, 1979, the US and China normalized diplomatic relations. American companies, from Coca-Cola to Boeing, were invited to a China just beginning its market reforms under Deng Xiaoping. One of the key Communist Party leaders who supported Deng Xiaoping's reforms was Xi Zhongxun. In 1979, as the top official in Guangdong province, Xi Zhongxun played a pivotal role in implementing China's first special economic zones, including Shenzhen. He helped turn Shenzhen from a small fishing village into China's third largest city and the fourth busiest container port in the world. This visionary leader is also the father of China's current president, Xi Jinping. In the 1980s and 1990s, a bargain was struck. The US would give China access to Western markets, and in return, China would liberalize its economy, maybe even its politics. The US first granted China Most Favored Nation, MFN, trade status in 1980, which lowered tariffs on goods imported from China. This status was renewed annually until 2000, when China was eventually granted permanent normal trade relations status, and President Bill Clinton pushed for China's entry into the WTO. US manufacturers outsourced labor to the Pearl River Delta. Retailers like Walmart and Costco flooded American shelves with Chinese goods, driving consumer prices down. On December 11, 2001, China officially joined the World Trade Organization. It was hailed as a win-win for globalization, but the scoreboard told another story. Over the next 15 years, the US lost millions of manufacturing jobs, many in the Midwest. Critics called it the China shock. Towns in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin shuttered. At the same time, Apple, Nike, and General Motors made record profits from producing at cheap Chinese cost and selling at American prices. The value of US goods imports from China rose from about $100 billion in 2001 to more than $400 billion in 2023. In 2016, Donald Trump campaigned on a clear promise: confronting China. By March 2018, that promise became policy. Trump's trade team, led by USTR Robert Lighthizer and Peter Navarro, invoked Section 301, accusing China of forced tech transfers and intellectual property theft. Section 301 wasn't new. It's a Cold War-era trade law passed in 1974 that allows the US to retaliate against what it sees as unfair trade practices. In the 1980s, Reagan used it aggressively against Japan over semiconductors, cars, and electronics. In the 1990s, Bush targeted South Korea, Brazil, and India. Clinton later turned it on China over intellectual property theft. After the creation of the WTO in 1995, The US leaned into that multilateral framework, filing cases against China's subsidies, rare earth quotas, and tech mandates. But after 2 decades of unmet expectations, frustration set in. China hadn't opened up as Washington hoped. In 2002, President George W. Bush imposed tariffs on imported steel, including from China. It triggered global backlash, especially from the EU and Japan, and was ultimately withdrawn in 2003 after the WTO ruled it illegal. Then, in 2009, under President Obama, the US imposed a 3-year tariff on Chinese-made tires after a surge in imports threatened domestic manufacturers. China retaliated by targeting US poultry exports with anti-dumping duties. Obama's team filed more WTO complaints against China than any other administration. They challenged rare earth export restrictions, solar panel subsidies, and state-driven tech mandates. After years of WTO diplomacy without much result, Trump returned to unilateral action, and he used it on a full scale. December 1st, 2018, Vancouver. Meng Wanzhou, CFO of Huawei and daughter of the company's founder, steps off a Cathay Pacific flight from Hong Kong. She's en route to Mexico with a layover in Canada, but she never makes her next flight. At the request of the United States, Canadian authorities arrest her on the spot. No cameras, no warning. Meng wasn't just a top executive. Her father, Ren Zhengfei, is a former Chinese army engineer who built Huawei from a reseller of phone switches into the world's largest telecom equipment supplier. Officially, Meng was charged with bank fraud, accused of misleading HSBC about Huawei's business dealings with Iran. But the timing was too perfect, the target too symbolic. At the very moment Washington was escalating tariffs and accusing China of stealing American technology, it made a high-profile arrest. To many in Beijing, this wasn't law enforcement. It was hostage diplomacy. Just days later, China detained Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, 2 Canadian citizens working in China. The message was crystal clear. For nearly 3 years, Meng Wanzhou remained under house arrest in Vancouver, fighting extradition in court. The saga became a standoff between global powers, with Canada caught in the middle, and Huawei's future hanging in the balance. On September 24, 2021, Meng boarded a chartered Air China flight home. For the US, Huawei had been placed on the entity list, effectively cutting it off from American suppliers like Qualcomm, Intel, and Google. The tech war was now official, and Huawei, once poised to dominate global 5G, had become its first major casualty. But Huawei was just the beginning. In summer 2020, the Trump administration labeled TikTok a national security risk, citing concerns that ByteDance, which owns the popular app, could be compelled by Chinese law to share data with the Chinese government. Trump signed an executive order giving ByteDance 45 days to divest TikTok's US operations or face a ban. For a moment, the world's most downloaded app became a geopolitical hostage. It wasn't an isolated case. It was part of a broader US crackdown on Chinese tech companies, including WeChat, Huawei, ZTE, DJI, and SMIC, as well as scrutiny of Chinese researchers and export restrictions. The line between commercial competition and national security had blurred completely. Beijing didn't take long to respond. Since late 2020, the Chinese government has formalized, then increasingly tightened export controls over key rare earth elements. Together, these 17 minerals power everything from electric vehicles' batteries to fighter jets. And China controls 60 to 70% of rare earth mining and about 90% of refining and processing capacity, making it the dominant global supplier. In 2023, China introduced licensing requirements for their export, with a major extension announced in April 2025. The trade conflict has expanded from tariffs to technology and now to critical materials and minerals, with both sides using export controls as leverage. For decades, US policy toward China was built on engagement, the belief that trade would lead to openness and reform. That belief is dead. Trump made the break noisy. Biden made it permanent. Instead of reversing course, Biden, the centrist, escalated. Quietly, methodically, structurally. Here are 3 key moves that confirmed the shift. 1. The CHIPS and Science Act. $70 billion to bring chip-making home and cut reliance on China and Taiwan. 2. Export controls. The US banned sales of advanced chip tools to China and convinced Japan and the Netherlands to do the same. 3. Tariffs. In 2024, Biden raised tariffs on $18 billion in Chinese imports, targeting EVs, solar panels, batteries, and critical minerals. These hikes will roll out through 2026. The names and tones may differ, but the strategic line is clear. America's policy toward China has fundamentally changed, and there's no going back. What began as a traditional trade war over goods has evolved into the most intense economic confrontation of our time. A full-spectrum warfare of supply chains, technology, and leverage. But the US isn't fighting alone, and China isn't backing down. In our next episode, we'll dive into China's retaliation playbook and explore why Beijing has chosen to weaponize its most strategic advantage, rare earth minerals. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and drop a comment. What do you think comes next in this new era of economic power struggles?